I mean, that was actually the Molasses Act, which was passed in 1733. But I mean, there was regulations about the ships that had to be used in trade. But one of the things we mentioned were these enumerated products. The Navigation Act's enumerated products that could only be sold to Britain, like tobacco. But the Navigation Acts, obviously, were intended to enrich the empire, and in particular the mother country. Why would the colonies put up with the Navigation Acts for so long? Really, a backlash against the Navigation Acts doesn't really come into force until 100 years after they were passed. What did we say was Britain's kind of attitude about enforcing the Navigation Acts? What did they do? Go ahead, Kelly. Or what didn't they do?
I missed that.
That's all right. Go ahead, Murray. What did they do, or what didn't Britain do with the Navigation Acts? Yes, the British didn't really vigorously enforce the Navigation Acts. Britain's attitude about its American colonies had been haphazard from the very beginning. They hadn't put much attention into colonizing, they hadn't spent much money in colonizing, and then when it came to enforcing the Navigation Acts, they did so lacklusterly. We call that salutary neglect, right? Salutary neglect. But now, in the aftermath of the French and Indian War, with this new, larger empire, with more demands on the British government, they vow to more vigorously enforce the Navigation Acts. And one of the things they are going to use to enforce that Navigation Acts are writs of assistance. What were the writs of assistance? Does anyone recall besides Josh and myself? Go ahead, Josh.
They were the authority by Parliament so that they could search and seize anything related to London.
Yes, the writs of assistance were a form of search warrants. They were global search warrants that allowed customs officials to search more broadly and widely for contraband, things that were being illegally imported or exported in port cities. And certainly the writs of assistance gave, customs officials more far-reaching authority to look for violators of the Navigation Acts. Remember, we said it is James Otis who is working for the merchants in Boston to oppose the writs of assistance when they came to court for reauthorization in 1761. And it is Otis that makes the case against the writs of assistance based on the idea of natural rights. And so we talked a little bit about natural rights, and our discussion of natural rights spilled into our conversation of how Britain attempted to deal with its financial problems. We said, look, Britain had problems managing and protecting the new territory that they acquired, and we talked about that. We talked about Britain attempting to sort of enforce mercantilism, and we talked about that. And then we said the other problem that Britain had was that Britain had a lot of debt. That 60% of the income that was coming into the British Treasury was going to service a debt that had been accumulated over 4 wars for empire. And so they needed revenue. And they kind of decided that they were going to try to tap the colonists to contribute to their treasury. And so they do this starting with, what was the name of the prime minister that kind of was in charge or took control of trying to straighten out Britain's financial situation? Go ahead, Chelsea. George Grenville, right? And it is George Grenville that proposes to Parliament the Sugar Act, right? And we talked about the Sugar Act, and there was a lot of details about the Sugar Act, 3 pence, 2 pence, this, that, lowering taxes, raising taxes. But when it was all said and done, the preamble of the Sugar Act said that the purpose of this legislation was to generate...
Mr. Reed, please call 5741. Mr. Reed, 5.
Oh, yes, the Sugar Act. Yes, the Sugar Act. And so when it was all, I was going to ask this question, when it was all said and done, right, the big problem with the Sugar Act was what? So I mean, we talked about all this stuff, and we said there was opposition to the Sugar Act, and there was a reason why. Go ahead, Junior.
Wait, so it was made to generate revenue?
Yes. And that was the big problem, right? The big problem with the Sugar Act is the stated purpose of the legislation was to generate revenue for the crown. the colonists claimed was a violation of their natural rights. How so? Walk us through the argument really quickly. Can you walk us through the argument of how taxation for the purpose of generating revenue was a violation of the natural rights of the colonists? Go ahead, Nick. Woo, sorry.
When they tax them, they said, the colonists said they didn't have representation in Parliament.
Okay. Taxation, is taxation voluntary? No, you must pay. So the government is taking your money, right? You don't have a choice, right? If somebody takes your money without your consent, what is it? Stealing. That's a violation of your natural right of property, right? Remember, by this time the colonists had argued that people were born with certain natural rights, life, liberty, and property. Oh, who was the thinker that they drew upon, that they came up with those ideas? There were many thinkers that talked about natural rights, but the ones going was Locke. The Lockean idea that people had natural rights, life, liberty, and property. If the government takes your money, which is your property, without your consent, then they are violating your natural right of property. How do you concede to be taxed? I mean, how could you possibly give consent? What did they argue was the way that people would give consent to be taxed, J.O.?
Having a representative?
Yes. That the taxes were levied by a representative assembly in which the taxpayers were represented. And so what the colonists argued was simply this: look, Parliament has no American representation. And so while Parliament has an obligation to regulate trade in the empire, and while that might result in some taxes for the purposes of regulating trade, Parliament is not justified in levying or raising a tax for the specific purpose of generating revenue for their activities. That's a violation of our natural rights. It's a violation of our natural rights because we don't have any representation in Parliament. Taxation without representation is tyranny. James Otis said that, right? And so therefore the Sugar Act was considered to be a violation of their natural rights. Now, the Sugar Act generates some consternation, but not nearly the amount of consternation that the Stamp Act generates. The Stamp Act, generates a significant response on the part of the colonists. This is a more far-reaching tax. It's a tax that's external, one that people could see, one that they would overtly have to pay, and one that already existed in England. Right? The Stamp Act that the colonists reacted so vigorously to was a tax that already was in place in England. And so Grenville felt justified in taxing the American colonists in this way to generate revenue for the crown. Remember, Grenville was going to argue that basically what Britain wanted to do was collect from colonial America 1/3 of the cost of maintaining 10,000 soldiers in North America. And a Stamp Act to do this was justified in doing it. It represented relatively light taxation. But remember, we said, your textbook, I think, says that the colonists erupted in protest. And we talked about the various means by which, the colonists protested the Stamp Act. They had the resolutions. Patrick Henry proposed those resolutions on the floor of the Virginia House of Burgesses, and other legislatures also proposed resolutions, right, opposing the Stamp Act and maintaining that tax was a violation of their natural rights. The Stamp Act Congress met in New York and produced a document that opposed the Stamp Act. We talked about the colonial non-importation agreements. We won't buy anything from Britain anymore. And these non-importation agreements were going to be enforced by vigilante groups called the Sons of Liberty. What do I mean when I say vigilante groups? I got to stream it.
Rebellious people against.
No, that doesn't make you necessarily a vigilante. A vigilante is a group that has no official standing, right? So let's say, we live in a community, and it's crime-ridden, you know, and we say, oh, our community's crime-ridden, so we all get guns. And we walk around the streets, and when we see a crime happen, we shoot the perpetrators, right? That would tend to discourage it, you know. But we would call this vigilantism. We're kind of taking the law into our own hands. Well, that's what the Sons of Liberty were. They were vigilantes, right? I mean, they don't like the Stamp Act. There is a non-importation agreement, and to enforce this non-importation agreement, they took the law into their own hands, right? Remember, we said the Sons of Liberty discouraged people from collecting the tax, and how successful they were doing in doing so. And it does result in no taxes ever being collected. And we said that the Stamp Act was in fact repealed. Grenville was replaced, it was repealed, but it was replaced with the Declaratory Act. What did the Declaratory Act say? Does anybody recall besides the instruction? Yeah, go ahead, Alex.
It said that even though they're not taxing them through the Stamp Act, they still have the authority to tax them if they want.
Yes, I mean the Declaratory Act basically said that Parliament's power is supreme. We can tax you if we want to. I mean what the colonists were arguing is that Britain's power in America was limited. That Parliament had power in some areas but not in others. And what the Declaratory Act said is you can't have it both ways. Either Parliament is supreme or they're not, or it's not. Right? And what the Declaratory Act was asserting was the supremacy of Parliament in all areas. Taxation, whatever. And so eventually the Declaratory Act is kind of benign, but it sort of sets up the question. Either the American colonists are going to have to accept Parliament as supreme, or they're going to have to become independent. And in '66, when the Declaratory Act is passed, they're not ready for independence yet. But the die is kind of cast. Now remember, the Declaratory Act is followed up with the Townshend duties. And the Townshend duties are different than the Stamp Act in that they are internal taxes and they are products that are sold from Britain to America. The Townshend duties are protested just like the Stamp Act, not as vigorously. Oh, who was John Dickinson? Who was John Dickinson? Does anybody recall what was his connection to the Townshend duties? Right?
He was very against it.
He was against the Townshend duties. And what did he write? A series of newspaper articles that were published in several colonial newspapers. What were they called? Were they called Letters from a Farmer in PA? Right? And we said that these were influential articles that greatly influenced people to oppose the Townshend duties as really being taxation without representation. How did the Townshend duties eventually result in kind of the first significant bloodshed in the conflict between Britain and the colonies? Wow, that's a great question. Lucy LeMayo, you would be the person to answer that question. Bloodshed. First, now let's start this way, Lucy. What is the first significant bloodshed in this dispute?
The Boston Massacre?
The Boston Massacre, yes. And the Boston Massacre was what year? Anybody remember? Not that this is always important history. Do you remember, Lucy?
1770?
3. Is it 1770? 1770? Yeah, 1770, sorry. You're right, 1770. 1770, okay? Now, 1770 is the Boston Massacre. How are the Townshend Acts connected to that event? Anybody? Anybody? Go ahead, Jenny.
There were soldiers that were there that were supposed to be enforcing that act.
So the soldiers that were in Boston, that massacred, if you want to use that term, the people that were there that night were there to protect customs officials who were attempting to collect the Townshend duties, right? So the connection between the Boston Massacre and the Townshend duties is that troops were there in an attempt to protect the people who were collecting the Townshend duties. And eventually those troops come into conflict with the people in Boston, and that conflict results in the Boston Massacre. In the aftermath of the Boston Massacre, though, there is a period of relative quiet, because the Townshend duties are repealed, except for one. Right?